This afternoon, I'm very pleased and we are very honored to welcome David J. Firestein to Michigan State University. For those of you who have been here for more than a year or two, you may have been to earlier talks that Mr. Firestein has given at Michigan State University. We've had a long and very happy relationship. He has been coming to Michigan State for almost a decade now. And on every occasion that he comes, usually annually, occasionally with a year sort of out in between, he's delivered a number of really fascinating talks on subjects that span Asia. Let me say a few words about David Firestein. He is the Perot Fellow and the East-West Institute's Senior Vice President for the Strategic Trust Building Initiative and Track 2 Diplomacy. I won't explain what Track 2 diplomacy is, but I'm sure he'd be happy to if you were to ask him that question. It's actually a very interesting approach to international relations. And in this capacity, he oversees the East-West Institute's China, East Asia, and United States program, and the Russia and the United States program, as well as the Institute's work on US-Iran trust building. So three very interesting and complicated relationships. He was a career US diplomat from 1992 to 2010. He's an expert on China, Russia, public diplomacy, and US politics. He's the author of a number of books focusing, for the most part, on the China-America relationship. He's written numerous articles, over 100 in various leading newspapers, both Chinese and US. He's also had long relationships with a number of universities in the United States, most recently and for us most proudly Michigan State University, but also prior to that the University of Texas at Austin and the Moscow State Institute. He's won a number of awards. I'll mention just one, the 2006 Secretary of State's Award for Public Outreach, but also teaching awards, and I think you'll see why in a few minutes. He holds a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University in International Relations and master's degrees from the University of Texas in Public Affairs and Asian Studies. And last but not least, and perhaps in some ways most important for this evening, his relationship with China goes back over 30 years. And he has witnessed since the early 1980s, which is just a few years after China's first agricultural liberalization, he's witnessed the momentous changes in the economy, politics, international relations, and society of China. And we look forward very much to hearing from you, Mr. Firestein. Welcome again to Michigan State University.
So much for the very warm and the very gracious introduction. I always feel privileged to spend time with you and to be at the Asian Studies Center here, which you direct. In my judgment, indisputably, Michigan State's Asian Studies Center is one of the premier Asian studies institutions in the country, and I really salute all that you do here. And I'm always honored to be involved in activities here and to have the opportunity and the privilege to interact with students, faculty, staff, and to keep coming back to MSU. As I've said before, it's kind of my adopted alma mater in a sense. I was born and raised in Texas. I went to Georgetown University and the University of Texas, but somewhere along the way, I started to bleed green. And I definitely am hoping that we take care of Wisconsin this Saturday, tomorrow, and I know we will do that. And I see a lot of green in the room, and I always feel very good to see that. So it's a privilege for me to be here. So what I'd like to talk about is the evolving framing of China in U.S. presidential campaign discourse. That's the topic that I want to address. And here, let me note at the outset that I don't just intend to talk about something that Donald Trump said yesterday or 3 days ago, or that Hillary Clinton said, etc., but rather to take a bit of a deeper look at the changing way that U.S. presidential candidates have talked about China and thought about China. And I would make the argument that how candidates talk about China reflects an evolution in the thinking about and the framing of China. So language matters, rhetoric matters, and I think it gives us deeper insights into how the U.S. political establishment looks at China. And so what I'd like to do is talk about the topic in a kind of a broader level talk a little bit about the history. I'll try to be briefer than I might normally be for the sake of time. I'm cognizant that it is a Friday afternoon, and to some degree I might be the only thing standing between people and the beginning of their weekend, which is always a precarious place to be as a speaker. But nevertheless, I'll lay that out as a backdrop for a discussion in greater depth about what's happening in America today in terms of how candidates talk about China. So the specific topics that I'll address are a little bit about the history, starting in 1989. I'll start with that point. Needless to say, one could go back further, but for purposes of brevity and focus in my presentation, I'll use that as a critical juncture that defines or sets off, if you will, kind of the modern era in presidential discourse about China, recognizing that one could do long presentations about earlier periods as well. After that, I'll talk about the different stages since that time in the way that U.S. presidential candidates look at China, think about China, frame China. I will pay particular attention to the 2010 through 2012 period, which I argue is a key transitional period in the framing, the domestic U.S. political framing of China. And then, of course, I'll spend probably the majority or largest plurality of my time on the 2016 campaign. And here I'll actually present some original research that I've done. And when I get to that point, I'll also recognize some of my colleagues who have helped me in that effort. But we actually have original research that is stuff that we've looked at that no one else has looked at, and I'll present some of the findings based on some of the data that we've crunched. And finally, I'll conclude with some analytical observations and conclusions. So again, I do hope to fit that into a shorter period of time than I might normally, because I'm cognizant that I want to leave plenty of time for your questions and comments, and also for the issue of, for the reception that we're going to have afterwards. So let me just start with kind of the modern history of the framing of China in U.S. presidential campaigns. And I think the basic point that I would want to make is, let's just start with 1989 as a critical moment in the U.S.-China relationship and a transformative moment in the U.S.-China relationship. All of us understand that in 1989 there was the student movement in Beijing. It was suppressed, and people refer to the June 4th incident, the Tiananmen incident, and so on. Not to dwell on that at this point, but the fact is that was really the beginning of the modern or contemporary period in the U.S.-China relationship. There are still effects, lingering effects, of that moment in the relationship that are with us today, and so I think it's relevant as we talk about how U.S. presidential candidates think about China and speak about it. So the three periods that I would just highlight, and again I'll try to abbreviate this a bit, are the period from 1989, specifically June 4th, 1989, to the year 2000, then the period 2000 to 2010, and then the period 2010 to the present. And in short, if I were sort of summarizing those basic periods, the point that I would make, and I'll flesh this out a little bit, is that in the year 1989, from 1989 to the year 2000, the principal issue or lens through which American presidential candidates and other candidates spoke about China was the lens of human rights. Human rights was the dominant issue on the agenda roughly for that decade. And needless to say, that was a direct reaction to the events of 1989, and I'll come back to that and talk about that in a little bit more detail. The second period I mentioned, 2000 to 2010, was a distinct period, and as I'll note in a minute, marked by China's accession to the WTO, and essentially China's joining in earnest of the world economy and the world economic and trade infrastructure. And from 2000 to 2010, we basically saw a scenario in which the way that U.S. presidential candidates spoke about China changed significantly, and the emphasis really became on China as a rising economic power and as a source of serious economic and trade competition to the United States. Now that is a very different framing of China than what we had seen the decade earlier. And then finally in 2010, and I'll spend some time in a few minutes talking about this because there are some very colorful vignettes to share about that period. There was still another transformation, and that's where I think we are with China today, with perhaps some caveats that I'll lay out later. And that is, rather than just talking about China as a rising economic power and source of competition particularly in the economic and trade areas, the framing of China became more China as existential competition or competitor to the United States. And that is a different and more profound framing of China than even in the previous 10 years. So we've seen an evolution, roughly divisible, I think, with logical nodes or dates or events into these 10-year periods. So the 10 years, 10 or 11 years after '89, the 10 years after China's accession to the WTO, and then actually about the 6 years that we have seen up to the present since 2010. Let me say a few more words about each of these historical periods, and then I'll come to the more immediate and contemporary elements of the talk. So just in terms of phase one, or the '89 to 2000 period, this was the immediate aftermath of Tiananmen, as we noted. Tiananmen had a deep impact on the U.S.-China relationship that is still present today, all these years later. The fact that China, unlike the USSR, the Warsaw Pact countries, Eastern Europe, the Velvet Revolution, the fact that China didn't have that kind of transformation in America's national security psyche set China apart from the world and made China a big issue in the United States in a way that it was not prior to 1989. The first presidential election after the 1989 events was, of course, the 1992 presidential election between the sitting president, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton, as well as Ross Perot, who ran as an independent candidate. And in that election, just as one soundbite that stays with us even today, Bill Clinton famously, or in the view of the Chinese probably infamously, referred as a candidate, as the Democratic candidate for president, referred to the leadership of China as, quote, the butchers of Beijing. That gives you a flavor for the type of tonality around China that we had in our presidential framing of China in 1992, and to a certain degree seeping into the 1996 election. It was also true, and I should note that in between presidential years, we also have our midterm elections. And obviously the president is not up for office during those years, but the entirety of the House of Representatives and the third of the Senate is. And you also saw the framing seeping into congressional races in these off or midterm years as well. So during this period, this was a period in which human rights dominated the agenda. And if I were summarizing this period with just a little phrase that I would use to kind of encapsulate everything I've said, it would be, from a U.S. vantage or from a candidate's vantage, quote, they, meaning China, quote, they don't share our values. That is the basic message of American presidential candidates during the 1990s up to 2000. So they're different from us, they don't share our values. Phase two, as I mentioned, is really a departure from the immediate post-Tiananmen period. And what we see is China gaining permanent normal trade relations, PNTR status, from the United States in the 1999-2000 period. That laid the groundwork for China joining the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 2001. And at that point, China became a serious economic presence in the world in terms of the infrastructure. Everyone understands what was happening in China in terms of growth at more than the 10% level per year. And China really got onto the radar of the United States in an economic sense and trade sense and economic and trade competition sense during this period. During this period, the issue of intellectual property rights infringement from a U.S. vantage, that is the Chinese infringement of U.S. intellectual property rights, became a really big issue. It already had started in the 1990s, but was becoming even more pronounced. And of course, the big issue of the loss of manufacturing jobs and the so-called outflow of these jobs, or quote, outsourcing of jobs from, frankly, Michigan and the Midwest of the United States and Ohio and Pennsylvania and so on, sort of the industrial heartland of America, to China. That became a big theme. That had not been a big theme previously, but it became a big theme during this period. So the issue of jobs. The other big issue that emerged on the U.S.-China agenda in a political sense, and that candidates spoke about, was the very substantial U.S.-China trade deficit. That is to say, the U.S. trade deficit with China, which didn't start during this period, but became very exacerbated and pretty substantial during this period. And so the notion of growing deficits started to enter our political rhetoric and the way that candidates spoke about and framed China. So the rhetoric shifted from a concern about human rights to a concern about China as an economic competitor. And I remember even in 2008, I remember seeing one particular Democratic candidates forum. It was not technically a debate, but it was held at Soldier Field in Chicago, the home of the Chicago Bears. Literally, the stadium was pretty full. Tens of thousands of people were there. And the numerous candidates who were running for president in 2008, including Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and quite a few others, were speaking. And if you look back at the text of the transcript of that event, you'll see that every candidate, and this is kind of an interesting sidebar that goes to a point that I want to make, was using the phrase, and I'm paraphrasing here, but using certain words that they used. If you elect me, I will, quote, get tough on China. The one thing that every single Democratic candidate who spoke before tens of thousands on national television said was tough on China. And it was all about the economics. I used to joke that if in that year and in many years, if you were to take a presidential candidate from either party and wake them up in the middle of the night from a deep slumber, the first thing they would say when their eyes open were, tough on China, tough on China. And it would be an instinctive and reflexive thing for them to say, and it came through that event. But if I were summarizing this period, I would summarize it again analogous to the phrase I used earlier. To sum it up in one phrase, they, China, they are gaining on us and they are taking our jobs. That's the basic summary of this period from 2000 to 2010. Now I should note that during this period, China came to be utilized and thought of as a measuring stick in American political rhetoric. And it became at first to be utilized as a measuring stick for the personal toughness of candidates. So that in a sense what was happening with China per se was less important, but where China mattered to candidates was that it was a measuring stick against which they could prove how tough and how macho they were. So it didn't even matter what the details of the trade deficit were, the job outflow or outsourcing of jobs and so forth. What mattered was I can utilize China as a construct and as a metaphor to use the word tough and to show the American voters and primary voters that I am a tough person. So China became not an issue unto itself. It became a proxy and a measuring stick for personal toughness. By 2010, and I'll talk more about this and you'll see what I mean in a second, China became a measuring stick for something different. It became a measuring stick for America's national adequacy, or, to state it in the negative, for America's presumed national inadequacy. So rather than merely being a measuring stick for me, the candidate of either party, it now became a measuring stick against which we measured the United States as a nation among nations. And I'll give you a couple of examples about that. And that segues into this third period, which sets the backdrop for the present period and some of the specific campaign 2016 points that I want to make and the research that I want to share. But let me say a few words about what happened in 2010, because it was a remarkable transformation in the framing of China. Let me also note, just as a sidebar, in terms of the title of this presentation, The Framing of China, or Framing the Dragon, China in U.S. Presidential Campaign Discourse, I chose the word framing advisedly, because the way we frame issues, etc., is very much what I'm talking about. But framing has another connotation, the connotation in the criminal sense of making someone the fall guy or the scapegoat for something that happened, to frame someone, quote unquote, for a crime. And I mean it intentionally to imply that there is an element of that other type of framing that is occurring in our discussions of China. To look at China and see China as the bad guy relative to the issues of economic and trade competition and so on. So I am not at all unaware of the connotations of the language that I chose, and I chose it with intentionality. Now, let's talk about 2010. I think if we look back at the history of the framing of China, another very clear demarcation point starts with the midterm elections of 2010, almost exactly 6 years ago. And in fact, even earlier as those elections started to unfold in earnest in the spring of that year. And what we saw was, rather than just being a source and being spoken about as a source of competition to the United States, candidates for Congress, to say nothing of those who subsequently soon ran for the presidency, which I'll talk about, started talking about China as a source of existential competition to the United States. And one point that I want to make that I think is very significant is that to understand how American presidential candidates understand and think about China and speak about China, you have to understand something about the domestic economic context in which the United States finds itself. In the 1990s, the United States was growing at a rapid pace. Our unemployment was at 4.6%. People's 401ks, their retirement savings were booming. The stock market was reaching one record after another after another. Home values were increasing, and people felt good about where they were as a country. Many jobs were created. People were working. The country was working. Nobody poked holes in the 4.6 figure and said, well, there are people out of the workforce. America was doing well from an economic standpoint. Our national budget, our federal budget was balanced, for example, during that period. Now, in 2010, remember where the United States was in contrast. Our unemployment in 2010 reached its peak in the modern era, 10.4%. And a point that I have often made and played a little bit with some of the data to look at the underlying data as well, is that, to use a phrase I've used, China looks very different to Americans when unemployment in America is 4.6% than it does when unemployment is 10.4%. So it may be that China's not doing anything differently. It may just be that we're perceiving China's actions and China's existence differently because our own economic circumstances are different. And I had posited that if you were to graph out U.S. Popular opinion about China, which tends to fluctuate to a degree in a certain pretty defined range, that probably you'll find that as U.S. unemployment increases, negative sentiment toward China increases as well. And so you have a kind of correlation there. And from the limited data that I've looked at, there seems to be a correlation. It's worth looking into in greater depth. But the point that I would make is this is where America was. And all of a sudden, the way we talked about China started to change. Let me give you 4 examples. I'll try to be brief, but these are worth mentioning. And I'll cut out other parts of my talk here to keep it within the time parameters. But this is really where things started to change in this country in terms of how presidential candidates and candidates for Congress and others started thinking about and framing China. The first data point is probably one of the most colorful and remarkable. Everyone here, being associated with Michigan State, loves the American sport of football, as I do. Let me give you an example from the NFL that relates to the NFL. There was going to be a Monday night football game in Philadelphia in the fall of 2010. The Philadelphia Eagles were going to be hosting the Minnesota Vikings for a Monday night game. Something happened that had never happened in my memory as a football fan. The game was canceled. It was canceled because of a blizzard in Philadelphia. And that led to a remarkable statement being made by the then governor of Pennsylvania, Ed Rendell. Ed Rendell said, and I'm quoting directly, he said, quote, "We have become a nation of wusses. We have become a nation of wusses." And then he said, if this were China, they would have tens of thousands of Chinese young people on the streets clearing out the snow, clearing the snow from the field and solving calculus problems while they did so. And that's a very nearly exact quotation from Ed Rendell, almost word for word. That's what he said. Now, what did the Philadelphia Eagles and the Vikings and being snowed out on that Monday night have anything to do with China, a country that in fact doesn't play professional football? And the answer is nothing, but also everything, because where America was at that moment, I think, was crystallized in that statement by Governor Rendell, which got national attention. And that was, for me, and I'm the only person that sort of honed in on that and frankly led to this research. That was ground zero. That was the first sentence uttered that reflected the new sentiment about China in this country, which is that even on things like a Monday night football game, we were now comparing ourselves to China and coming up short. And that was where we started to be at that time. But there are a couple of other interesting anecdotes as well. If we look at President Obama, and not long after the fall of 2010, as the sitting president, he made a State of the Union address in January of 2011. And he did something remarkable. Now, all presidents, when they give the State of the Union address, have a domestic policy section and a foreign policy section. And President Obama essentially followed a well-worn model that we've seen for decades from presidents. And on the night of the State of the Union address, he spoke, and he spoke about China. What was remarkable was he made no reference to China in the foreign policy section of his speech. Zero. None. He made several references to China in the domestic policy section of his speech. I was the first person to point that out in an article I did at the time. And he said, I'm paraphrasing loosely here, but where it comes to competition over the production of solar panels, over wind energy, over clean energy, over clean coal, education scores, manufacturing, we're losing to China. He made, I think, perhaps it was 4 references, it was either 3 or 4, in that speech. All of them were in the domestic policy section, and in all of them he was comparing the United States to China and saying that we were either falling behind or in danger of falling behind. In the foreign policy section, not a mention of China. So that's interesting. Now, both Rendell and Obama are Democrats. Let me just make a couple of brief points on the Republican side of the aisle. In that year, Newt Gingrich, the former Speaker of the House, made the comment, and I won't dwell on it, that if we don't get our act together and really start working in a concerted way toward rebuilding our space capabilities, quote, China will colonize the moon before us. So here again, in reference to a domestic program, space, not a military program per se, Gingrich was saying that we're losing to the Chinese. And then the 2 points I want to make that really amplify the point is in the Republican debates for president in 2008, in 2012, again, we're talking about the 2010 period to the present. In 2012, there were about 24 GOP primaries debates where the GOP candidates debated amongst each other. About 1/4 of those debates were billed as foreign policy debates. About 6, roughly, of the 24 were foreign policy debates. They were advertised as, this will be a national security foreign policy debate of the Republican candidates. In the 6 foreign policy debates, China was not mentioned once among any of the candidates running for President of the United States on the Republican side. In the domestic policy debates, China was repeatedly mentioned. So China became a domestic political issue in the year 2010 through 2012. We saw that with the Rendell statement, we saw that in 2011 with the Obama statement, and the fact that he didn't think of China as a foreign policy issue. We saw that emphatically with the Republican debates in 2012, and then best for last. Ultimately, Mitt Romney won the Republican nomination, and then contested the race, obviously, with sitting President Barack Obama. Romney said something, and he said it more than once, he said it twice, on the record. It was not a slip of the tongue because he repeated it consciously later after he said it the first time. That is the most remarkable statement I've ever heard in the history of American presidential rhetoric relative to China. He said, and I'm paraphrasing very closely, this is on the record, he said, if I become president, when I'm in the Oval Office, I will look at the federal budget, which is about $4 trillion. I will look at the federal budget and I will ask myself, in reference to every dollar of that budget, one and only one question. This is his words. Is this federal spending, worth borrowing money from China to undertake? And if the answer is yes, then we'll do it. And if the answer is no, we won't. Now, in all of my life and in all of American history, I have never heard a major candidate for president apply what I call the China test to all federal spending. But that's what Romney did as a major, serious presidential candidate in 2012. That is stunning and remarkable beyond even my ability to describe, because it shows how deep under the skin China got into political discourse in this country. To say that everything we do, every social security dollar, every defense dollar, every education dollar, everything we do is all about, is it worth borrowing from China? That is a remarkable statement. And that's where we got to in the 2010 to 2012 period. So to sum this period up in a statement, whereas it used to be they don't share our values, and then it was they're gaining on us and they're stealing or they're taking our jobs, this summary would be they're eating our lunch, they are beating us. That's where we ended up in 2010, 2012. Let me now shift briefly to 2016. I'll try to condense a little bit here and then share some of the key points and conclude. Some things have changed. We're in a different place in this election than we were in a number of ways. For one, it's an open election. There's no incumbent president. For another, there's no Chinese transition taking place, which, by the way, I was the first person to point out that in 2012, you had an unprecedented confluence of 3 events that had never occurred before in the same year in all of human history. A Chinese leadership transition in 2012, a US presidential election in 2012, and by the way, a presidential election in Taiwan in 2012. And because of China's 5-year system and our 4-year cycle, that only can happen every 20 years, but it had never happened before because 20 years prior to that, Taiwan had not had a presidential election. So it was a remarkable political year, certainly for the US and the mainland, but also factoring in Taiwan as well. And this year, we don't have that. Meanwhile, the US economy has bounced back. No one would say, I don't think even Republican critics of Obama would say the economy today is as bad as it was in 2009 and 2010. There is debate as to whether the real unemployment rate is what it is said to be, etc., but no one would disagree with the fact that we're better off than we were by most measures. Meanwhile, there are different fears that are dominating, or different concerns and fears among the public, dominating the foreign policy agenda. ISIS, probably principal among those. But the fact that Russia now is a frontier security issue for the United States in a way that it wasn't before is also out there. Iran is an issue and a presence in the campaign, particularly last year during the primaries, in a way that it wasn't before. And of course, in addition to all of these things, you have the very unusual and thus far once-in-a-lifetime phenomenon of Donald J. Trump as a candidate for president, and that's bringing interesting dynamics into the race as well. Now here, let me just say briefly, I want to thank Andy Joe, Fiona Masland, and Jay Chun for their important contributions in helping me do the research that I'm going to talk about in a moment. They were great in helping me track down the specific data that I was trying to obtain. And what I did, looking at the 2016 race with the help of my colleagues, was to actually look at a specific data set, and namely the transcripts of the debates amongst the Democrats and amongst the Republicans. So the Democratic primaries debates, the Republicans primaries debates. Bottom line, we looked at all of the debates word for word, and we simply assessed what was said in empirical, quantifiable, measurable terms. No one else had or has done that. And so in a moment, I'll share with you some of the key findings from that. And it gives a quantifiable sense to some of the phenomena that we're talking about in reference to the way changes in the tonality, changes in the framing, but also, very importantly, distinctions and, in some cases, commonalities between Democratic framing of China and Republican framing of China, as well as specifically between Hillary Trump and Donald Trump and some of the others. So, let me make a couple of brief points. As a preface to laying out the data, which is the final part of my main part of my presentation, I just want to say, we had looked qualitatively at what, at the time we conducted the research, the remaining candidates in the race had to say about China. At the time we did this, it was Hillary versus Bernie, and on the Republican side, that was the Democratic side, of course, on the Republican side, Trump versus Cruz versus Governor Kasich. That's who was in the race at the time we were crunching the data. And now, I won't go into all of those, but let me make a brief comment about Hillary and about Donald Trump, obviously the two remaining general election candidates from the major parties. So what was interesting about Hillary Clinton is that she referenced China, but she did so in a way that was quite unusual. Her main references to China were about how the fact that she had worked with China and worked with the Chinese leadership and worked on China as Secretary of State demonstrated that she had the experience and the judgment to be president. And note what I'm saying. She did not criticize China. She did not comment a lot about Chinese, quote unquote, theft of American jobs, outsourcing. She really spoke about China mostly, and I say this based on empirical data. We looked at what she said. She really spoke about China most often as, see, I am adult enough to be president. I have worked with the most important countries in the world, case in point, China. I have stood with Xi Jinping, and so forth and so on and so forth. So she used China as a credentialing mechanism in a way that candidates had not before. Now, that was the main point that she made. She did make references to climate change and other issues. At one point, there was even a very interesting exchange between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders in one of the debates about whether one should respect or not respect Henry Kissinger, mostly on the issue of China, which was one of the more bizarre moments in the race. But anyway, that was her main framing. To Trump, let me just say, and then I'll shift over to the key points, my analytical observations based on the data. Trump was all over the place, still is, on the issue of China. Here I'm speaking specifically on the issue of China. On the one hand, he did something no U.S. presidential candidate in all of American history has ever done. He stated, and I quote his words directly, "I love China," unquote. And I repeat, he said, quote, "I love China," unquote. He said that many, many, scores and scores of times. No U.S. candidate for president, that to my ability to research, has ever stated that they love China. Chinese, I respect the Chinese leadership. The Chinese leadership is smarter than our leadership. Their leaders are smart. Our leaders are dumb. They're winning, and so forth. On the negative side of the ledger, however, Donald Trump also said, China has perpetrated the greatest theft of American jobs, specifically the greatest theft in human history. Those are his exact words. China has perpetrated against us the greatest theft in human history. His words, referencing China's, quote, stealing of U.S. jobs. He also said, if he were president, as we all know, he would slap tariffs on companies, he would retaliate against U.S. companies that outsource to China, and so forth and so on, opening up to criticism from the Democratic side that he himself produces a lot of things in China, etc. The point that I'm making is that he has been quite literally all over the place on China and stepped on his own message in a way that it's hard for people to understand where he really is on China. But in one regard, he has said something no one's ever said, and that is that he loves China. Now, I could talk more about others, but they're out of the race, and obviously that's old news. So, with that being said, let me tell you a little bit about, and I'll try to be brief here, in maybe 5 minutes, just say a few words to conclude about what my analytical observations based on real data, actual empirical data, are with respect to the data set of the Democratic and Republican debates. And so here, I'll give you information generated from literally word searching China, Chinese, and related words in these texts. And again, my gratitude to my three colleagues, Andy, Fiona, and Jade, for their help in doing this. So first of all, here are points that are supported by the data. Number one, Republicans mention China more often than Democrats overall in this race, and by a substantial margin. So the word China, Chinese, etc. came up a lot more from the Republicans than it did from the Democrats. Number two, among the Democrats, references to ISIS, Russia, and Iran, and again, we word searched this, so this is specific data. References to ISIS, Russia, and Iran all outnumbered references to China, which lends support to a statement that I had made even prior to the research that was instinctive, that in fact, ISIS/terrorism and Russia and Iran had essentially displaced China from being a significant foreign policy issue in this race. And in fact, on the Democratic side, the data showed exactly that. On the Republican side, however, only ISIS, of the three that I mentioned, was mentioned more than China. It was. But China was mentioned more often than Russia and Iran, which bolsters the point I made earlier that there was more attention paid by the Republicans to China than there was by the Democrats. So that's consistent. And in short, China became, and I believe still is, a significant factor in the Republican presidential candidate discourse to a greater degree than what we've seen on the Democratic side. Another point, among Democrats, among the two Democrats that we looked at the time we were conducting the research, and for most of this race it was a two-person race between Clinton and Sanders. Sanders referenced China more than Clinton, in fact by a pretty good margin. As I mentioned, Clinton really only referenced China as a credentialing mechanism to say, I have the judgment and experience because I've dealt with the big players of the world like China. And Sanders spoke about other things which I'll talk about, but Sanders talked more about China than Hillary Clinton did. Hillary Clinton, to be honest, has been very quiet overall on China. And that's what the data says relative to years past, if you can compare her to other candidates that were in her position. On the GOP side, Trump, by far, referenced China more than all of the others, including the other 16 candidates that were in the race. And he had the largest plurality of references to China of any Republican candidate. So he was by far the person talking about China the most, but as I said, on the one hand he said he loved China. The very next sentence he said they have perpetrated upon America the greatest theft in human history, but I do love them and they're smarter than us, but I will bash them when I become president. And I'm not joking, those statements were made within the same 10 to 15 seconds. So, but nevertheless, he was speaking about China more than any other candidate, by far. In both the Democratic and Republican parties, this is my next point, economic references to China far outstripped security and human rights references, which is consistent with the overall trend line that I've laid out. It allows us to conclude that economics and trade and sort of these existential competitive issues remain the key issue insofar as presidential candidate framing of China is concerned. But there was more referencing to security issues relating to China and human rights than either 2012 or 2008. So while economics is still the dominant issue, the fact is there is a greater diversity of comments about China this year than there was in the past, because basically the issue of China as a security issue or a human rights issue was essentially completely absent in the last couple of presidential races. So that's different. But the Republicans, more than the Democrats, that is to say, they made more references to security and human rights than the Democrats, who in turn were mostly focused on the economics. It's also worth noting that only one major candidate in this race on the candidate's official webpage did not have a reference to China. That is to say, there was only one candidate where the word China, through a word search effort, was not on his page. That was Ted Cruz. And I could riff on that a little bit. There's a deeper story there, but I don't want to go into it here. Happy to address it in Q&A and also your other questions. But Ted Cruz was the only candidate that did not reference China on his own candidate's web page, which was interesting. So that's interesting. Now let me conclude with a few final broader points here, and I'm just about done. So in terms of broader sort of so what points from all of this, one point is it's clear that China has returned to being a foreign policy issue again, from having been out in the wilderness in that regard over recent years. China became in 2010, 2012, as I documented, a domestic policy issue of the United States of America. It wasn't even talked about, it wasn't thought about as a foreign policy issue. The term military was not used in reference to China in either of those races. The term South China Sea was not used. The term Taiwan was not used. It was only talked about as an economic issue. This year, it's back to also being, to a modest degree, a security and foreign policy issue. So there's a certain return to normalcy in that regard, or at least to the historical trend line. Second, the focus has expanded greatly relative to 2012, with security and human rights references up. And there have been references during the debates that we looked at, again, we looked at specific data, to things like, and I'm citing things that we found, South China Sea, cyber espionage, DPRK, the issue of North Korea, China's, quote, aggressiveness, China's role in the Asia Pacific, and even the issue of Taiwan. For the first time, maybe ever, in the past 25 years, Taiwan has actually been mentioned in a debate. It was not 4 years ago, it was not 8 years ago, but it has been this year. Not a major point, but it came up. So the number of references to China and the diversity of those references has increased. Third point, China is still a measuring stick, yes, for personal toughness, yes, for national adequacy. But now it's also a measuring stick, as Hillary Clinton has made it clear, for credentials to be president. It's a measuring stick for judgment and experience, that this is an adult-level candidate who's dealt with the serious players in the world. That's a new type of measuring stick effect that we're seeing with China, and that's new. Third point, or fourth point of these broader points, China has, as I noted earlier, been largely displaced by, to a large degree, by ISIS and terrorism, by Russia, and certainly last year, prior to the agreement with Iran being signed over the nuclear issue, Iran. So ISIS, Russia, ISIS terrorism, Russia, Iran have essentially displaced and dislodged China from its frontier position as a foreign policy issue in this country. So yes, it's a little bit more foreign policy oriented and thought of that way than it was X number of years ago, but still, compared to the bigger challenges as measured in number of references, China is a second tier issue in a way that it was not in 2012 or earlier. Couple of last points. There are different views, obviously, both within the Democratic Party, within the Republican Party. Of course, now we have two candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. There are different views among the candidates. But as odd as this may sound, even taking into account some of the seeming inconsistencies, at least of tonality, within the comments of Donald Trump, notwithstanding, almost every comment that has been made about China has been within the mainstream of U.S. commentary about China. Perhaps with the sole exception of the words, "I love China," which have never been uttered by a U.S. presidential candidate before. A lot of candidates say, "I love America." Very, very few, none, have ever said, "I love China, I love Russia." Again, Trump is blazing new trails in those regards. The point that I would make is, apart from that one comment, nothing he said is actually, odd as it may sound, that different from things that we've heard at different points from different people. He is not the first candidate to say China's beating us. We've documented that. He's also not the first candidate to say I'll get tough on China, I'll bash China, I'll put tariffs on China. Others have said that. So the fact is, when you strip away the tonality and the rhetoric and the metaphors and some of the more colorful language, U.S. presidential candidate discourse on China this year has largely been within the rails of the mainstream of discourse on China. For example, no one is saying, elect me president and I will de-recognize the People's Republic of China, I will recognize the Republic of China on Taiwan, and so forth and so on. No one is really out in the extreme on these issues. So that's an interesting point. It's one to keep in mind. You have to go a little beneath the surface to see that, but it's true. And the final point I would make is that if you look at how the Chinese have looked at U.S. presidential discourse, just as a sidebar, I think there has been a certain bemusement at some of the comments that have been made. Chinese, I think, have their differing views as to who might be better for China or for U.S.-China relations, just as Americans have their different views. But I will say that I have been impressed with what I think is a greater level of sophistication in Chinese understanding of and analysis of our political rhetoric and our political process. And I have to say I've been struck that people, I think, have not generally overreacted to some of the comments made by Donald Trump, even some of the comments that were somewhat more incendiary. By the same token, I would just make an observation that I think many Chinese continue to look at Hillary Clinton as someone who is unfriendly to China because of some of the comments that historically she made as First Lady, as Secretary of State, and in other contexts, referencing, quote, women's rights are human rights, an infamous phrase that she uttered in Beijing in 1995. I say that from the Chinese perspective. She also talked about media freedom as Secretary of State and so on. And in my personal opinion, the Chinese have got her wrong. But their perception is that she would be tougher on China and maybe worse for U.S.-China relations than Donald Trump would be. I think they are misreading her, but that is a view that is out there. So with that, let me stop and just say I'm very grateful for this opportunity. It's always an honor to be at the Asian Studies Center here. Siddharth, thank you so much for the gracious hospitality and your great introduction. Thank you for your generosity with your time, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
So everybody, Paige has a microphone. If you have any questions, she will come around. And keep in mind, if we aren't able to accommodate your questions now, there is a reception after this, and we can do one-on-one conversations as well. So, anybody?
Anyway, just quick elaboration of the track 2 diplomacy mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So a brief comment on that. So the East-West Institute is what we regard as a track 2 diplomacy hub. We're a foreign policy think tank based in New York City. We're really not a traditional think tank. We're kind of a think and do tank. We try to build trust between parties that don't have much trust, and we try to generate innovative policy workarounds to problems that are vexing governments and that could lead to conflict. Track 2 diplomacy is a kind of back channel or people-to-people diplomacy where people come together who are not in power, who are not officials. And government officials meeting is referred to as track 1. So track 2 is relative to track 1. Track 1 is governments. Track 2 is people who are not in government, but who are influential and have access to senior decision makers, who can come together and in an unscripted way lay out some interesting ideas and some innovative thinking, often with bouncing ideas off each other, U.S. representatives, Chinese representatives, U.S. and Russia, U.S. and Iran, and many other combinations, and then take that thinking informally back to people who are in power with the idea of bringing new and fresh thinking to those who are in a position to make a difference in terms of decision making. So it's a kind of private back channel, citizen-driven diplomacy that is often conducted with the blessing of, and sometimes at the request of governments, but that has the advantage of being unofficial by definition, and therefore people are free to say what they really think. They're not constrained by talking points, and you can often speak about issues with greater intellectual honesty and flexibility with an eye toward generating actionable solutions to some of the problems that we face. That's track 2 diplomacy, and that's a big part of what the East-West Institute does. Thank you. Yeah.
So what remarks, if any, have the 2016 presidential candidates made in regards to the South China Sea dispute? And then will it have any significant impact on this perception of China as a source of existential competition?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there have been a few references, and I can think of more from Hillary Clinton than I can from Donald Trump, but I think both have at least broadly been asked the question and addressed it. Nothing really newsmaking or headline-worthy in the responses. You know, the response from Clinton and the comments from Clinton about South China Sea have been pretty mainstream and pretty diplomatic. This is a serious issue. We have an interest in freedom of navigation. We have to make sure that the Chinese understand our position. We are going to make, I as president will make sure that we're operating from a position of strength. I'm paraphrasing, these are not exact words, but this is the messaging. And let me note the obvious, which is that this issue is well known to her, because this issue became a big issue in the U.S.-China relationship, and it's long been out there. But it became a big issue on the U.S.-China agenda when she was Secretary of State. And she gave a famous, or what the Chinese would call infamous, set of remarks in Hanoi in 2010, in which she stated emphatically that, or the Chinese felt emphatically, that the United States has a vital national security interest in freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, even though we are not a claimant to any of the land or water there. So Hillary Clinton is very much bound up with the issue of South China Sea and her capacity at that time as Secretary of State. She knows the issue well, and her remarks have been tempered, have not put herself in a corner, and they've been the kind of remarks that you would expect from a former Secretary of State. This is an important issue, we're going to deal with it, we're going to be strong, etc. Donald Trump, I think, has dealt with the issue a little bit, but less, and with less surgical precision, with less nuance, and more to the effect of, we're going to be tough, and again, these are not exactly his words, but the essence. When I'm president, people in the world will understand you can't mess with the United States. I'm tough, I'm strong, things are going to change, our current leadership is bad, I'm better, people will take me seriously. And it's in that vein that he's referred to things like China's role in the region and the South China Sea, to the very limited degree that he's talked about that. Most of Donald Trump's references to China, and we've studied this, have been about the economics and have been about the themes of competition, but going further than anyone has ever done, i.e. saying many, many times over, as part of his stump speech, the Chinese leaders are smarter than our leaders, they're beating us, they're killing us, metaphorically, and that will stop when Donald Trump, become president. So he's been much less detailed on the issue, and I think there's no evidence from his comments that he has a very deep grasp of the particulars of this issue. That doesn't mean he doesn't or does, it just means there's no evidence from his on-the-record comments. So he's dealt with it more glancingly, I would say. The bottom line, though, is I think that irrespective of who is elected president, I think that U.S. policy will likely be very consistent with respect to the South China Sea. I think any president of any party operating within the context of U.S. foreign policy, the Congress, the military advice, and so on, is going to probably advance U.S. interests in the South China Sea in largely similar ways. So there could be enormous differences between what our president would do if that president is Hillary Clinton versus if that president is Donald Trump. I don't think we would see those kind of differences on the South China Sea. So, and frankly, and I'll go one step further, that may, in a way that may even sound counterintuitive, irrespective of who wins, I actually don't think that there will be a significant impact on U.S.-China relations, more broadly. That may sound counterintuitive, but what has generally happened is whoever wins the presidency, and recognizing that in some ways we are in uncharted waters in this particular race. That being said, whatever happens, what has always happened is that presidents come in and are quickly, generally, historically at least, well advised and keep their eyes on the prize, and there is a long-term bipartisan continuity in our dealings with China. I suspect that would continue to be the case. And if I could speculate one sentence further, I think that if in fact Donald Trump were elected president, I believe what he would find is that, and I'm saying this kind of in an empirical sense, not as a critique, I think what he would find is that most of the things he has pledged to do repeatedly are not possible to do. And I don't mean that as a slam, it's just the truth. The president doesn't have some of the authorities that he seems to believe the president has, but there are things like the Constitution, laws, rules in WTO, and so on and so forth. And I suspect, this is just speculation, that if he were to be elected president and we're starting to say, well, now I want to slap these tariffs on and do these other things, he would be surprised to learn how limited presidential power can be, and he might be very disappointed and frustrated about that. That's just speculation. And I don't mean it as a critique, I just think that so many of the things he said he would do are at odds with the U.S. Constitution, law, and international law and norms that govern these issues. Yes, ma'am.
Right now, I know that President Obama, his policy to Asia is like pivot to Asia or people to Asia, or also mentioned as repower.
Rebalancing.
Yeah, rebalancing.
Yeah.
But I know that I heard that Hillary also kind of support this policy.
Yeah.
But you mentioned that right now we, as Chinese, kind of misunderstand what Hillary's like policy. But why you say that?
Well, those are good questions, and they're somewhat two different questions, because I think what China misunderstands about Hillary Clinton is that she has been Secretary of State. She has dealt with the Chinese. And I'm not saying this as an affirmation, but just objectively, she's had pretty substantial experience at the top level of diplomacy in America, the job of Secretary of State. She understands diplomacy, whether one agrees or disagrees with her positions. She understands how the world works. She understands WTO. She understands the UN and so forth. That was her job for 4 years as Secretary of State. And so I think you see a lot of people looking back to 1995 and a statement she made about human rights, which was a very innocuous statement, actually. It wasn't seen that way by the Chinese, but in fact it was a very innocuous and harmless statement. And they look back at media freedom speeches she's given and so on, and they think she's going to be unduly tough on China. But the reality is, she's had experience carrying out at the top level below the president, the day-to-day duties associated with the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world, which is the relationship between the U.S. and China. And I don't think, whether one is critical of her or supportive of her, I don't think anyone would contest that she has a tremendous depth of experience in the world because she was Secretary of State, if not for other reasons. And so the notion that she is going to be a bad president from the standpoint of China or U.S.-China relations because of things she said many years ago, I think is a misinterpretation of where she is. From an outside point of view, again, I say it in a nonpartisan sense, I perceive her as very bought into the well-established bipartisan consensus in Washington about how you deal with China. So I would be shocked if there were any significant changes in the U.S.-China relationship under a Hillary Clinton presidency. I don't think the Chinese generally get that, and that's where I think that they're, in my personal opinion, misreading Hillary in a negative direction, which is to say simply, I think she would be better for U.S.-China relations than most Chinese realize. But the point about the rebalancing or pivot is a different issue. I don't think that's why they necessarily take the view on Hillary that they do, although yes, she was Secretary of State when that was rolled out, that's true. But I think that was rolled out by the president and seen as a presidential initiative. But the rebalancing to Asia is nothing more than, and I think many Chinese don't understand it or don't buy into the construct, and that's perfectly fair. I happen to think the president was exactly right. I happen to think that that policy intellectually makes a lot of sense. And there are many reasons one could support. Because Asia is home to most of the hotspots in the world that could become major conflagrations. It is home to the most robust economies on the planet Earth. It is the biggest trading partner collectively with the United States and the biggest driver of GDP growth and jobs in this country. China even having overtaken Canada and so on. And I think it's like the analogy that I would use, and I have not heard others use this analogy. For those who invest in the stock market or mutual funds, advisors often say you have to have a particular objective, large cap stocks, mid cap stocks, small cap, and so on. And you have to monitor over time to make sure the balance is the original balance you wanted, 33%, 33%, 33%. If you have a lot of growth in large cap stocks and it gets out of whack, so that 70% of your holdings are large cap and less 30% of the others, you have to rebalance your financial portfolio. We are rebalancing our national security portfolio in that sense. We are rebalancing our strategic interests as a nation, our strategic attention, to get it back in alignment with where America's interests really are. I would argue, it may sound disingenuous, and I'm by no means, obviously, speaking for the government because I don't work for the government. I happen to think we got it right on this one. But the argument I would make is, and it may sound funny to Chinese, but the pivot or the rebalancing is a reflection of the importance that America attaches to China. It's actually a good thing, not a bad thing. But I'm very clear-eyed that China doesn't see it that way. But that's not something that I think the Chinese hang on the head of, or around the neck, if you will, of Hillary Clinton. They see that as an Obama initiative. And they see it that way because President Obama rolled it out himself in the Australian Parliament in a major speech. Other questions or comments? I think there's a question over on this side.
I was wondering if in your research of the speeches and of what Donald Trump has said, did you come across any statements that Donald Trump has made in terms of China and the DPRK, or have you spent any time on that in your research, and what have you found and what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the answer is yes. Donald Trump has talked about China and the DPRK. Let me also note, this is another area that was really not discussed in terms of commentary by presidential candidates about China 4 years ago or 8 years ago. It was a very minor issue if it was referenced at all. But in this cycle, Donald Trump, among others, has said that if he were president, that he would lean on, I'm not using his exact words, but he would lean hard on China to do much, much more to rein in North Korea. And what he has stated repeatedly on the record in debates and speeches is that in his judgment, China is in a position to wage massive influence over North Korea and basically to get North Korea to cease and desist from the problematic behavior that they're engaging in. Now, many people would disagree with that assessment, but many others would agree with that. And he is in the camp that believes that China is not doing all that it could be doing to rein in North Korea, and that if he were president, that would change. So that is the consistent message that he has shared in reference to the issue of North Korea, their nuclear tests, their missile tests, and so on. There is legitimate debate, and it's not even necessarily partisan debate, it's just debate within those who watch the issue of North Korea as to whether that assessment is correct or not. But it's certainly a legitimate position to take, and he's not the only one who's taken it. My read on the situation personally is a little different, but there are those who would say that he's correct. And that's what he has said, and that's a fairly mainstream kind of comment from some political circles in our system on the issue of North Korea. And that has come up, yes. Do we need to, okay, can we do one last question?
Yeah.
Okay, one last question. I think, sir, you had a question? Yeah. And that'll be the final one, and then I look forward to continuing our discussion during the reception. Yes, sir.
China as a part topic in the U.S. presidential campaign discourse. Does it mean China is a threat to U.S.? How do you think about the China threat theory?
Well, a lot of people use the term in China, the China threat theory, 中国威胁论. And it's often used, it's put out there as a discussion point. The truth of the matter is that I don't think that it may be overstating how the United States thinks about China. What I would say, using my words, is that I think that it's true that in the United States, across the partisan divide, both Democrats and Republicans, look at China and see what I would call an existential competitor to the United States. A competitor that could, if it defeats us in certain sectors of competition, could have a significant impact on our way of life. I don't know that I would go so far as to say, and I think that the data show this, if you look at people's comments and take those at face value, which is an assumption that one could make, there's not a lot of evidence to show that American political figures are talking about China as a threat to America, because that implies a different type of urgency, and it probably implies a military dimensionality that I don't think is present. I don't think any mainstream Republican or Democrat in this country, whether in the executive branch or in the legislative branch, thinks that China poses a military threat to the United States, thinks that China could defeat the United States, because it cannot. And now, China is a powerful country, but it is not the equal of the United States in a pure military sense. From the standpoint of the economy, the arguably will of the people, the size of the country, and the nuclear arsenal it has, and so on, China potentially has the capability to be potentially a threat. It certainly has the capability, and I think it is already a competitor to the United States. But I think if you talk about, do American political figures think of China as a threat per se, I would say I don't think so. I think American political figures think of China as a competitor, and as we've seen documented amply, they think of China as a competitor mostly in trade, economic, and other areas of national competition. Clean energy production, education scores, science and technology achievements, intellectual property competition and theft from the US perspective, cyber activities, and so on. That adds up to competitor. It doesn't add up to threat in my judgment. So I think Chinese misread and overstate the degree to which they believe that Americans regard China as a threat. There is an important distinction there to draw, and I would draw it. And with that, thank you all so much. Look forward to talking to
you. Thank you very much, David. And a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. And please, brings to this conversation. I hope you'll join us in the reception, and we can continue the conversation.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you.